The answer is most likely not. Reggie even said so in a recent interview where he said its lack of a localization actually has nothing to do with the content within the game. Which does sort of lead to the question of, then why? Why, Reggie? Why don't we have it, Reggie? But regardless, today I want to take a look at some of the reasons why people think the content is the reason to blame for the lack of localization. And then whether I agree with them or not, try to explain why I think it hasn't reached the US yet, or anywhere else for that matter. The first common reason I see is that it has major themes of bereavement and tragedy within families. Not only is Lucas's mother brutally murdered, his brother goes missing and then later at the end of the game commits suicide, and his father neglects him for a large portion of the game due to his missing brother. This is some pretty heavy stuff, and we always talk about how the EarthBound series has bright graphics and quirky dialogue juxtaposed with dark themes, but damn, at worst, Ness's dad wasn't home. He said he'd even try to make it to his birthday. In my opinion, this is one of the less likely reasons content would be to blame. Well, yes, I acknowledge these are very serious topics, and Nintendo often strays away from those kinds of things with most of their games. You have to remember that when Mother 3 was being developed for the N64, it very much was intended to be released in America at some point. And despite its years of development, its story, at its core, didn't change very much. The story differences between the original and the one we ended up with don't so much add new things, but subtract things. If you think Klaus committing suicide is controversial, apparently it was supposed to be an even darker ending in the original, though Toei has said that the ending is more or less the same from the original in terms of literal events. But with the development time of more than 10 years, if this truly was so controversial, why would it have been given a US promised release date for so long? Or at the very least be made very clear that it was intended to be released in the United States. This same reasoning props up my argument for why the Magypsies, the androgynous characters in the game, aren't to blame. Again, these characters were intended to be part of the story from the very beginning, and earlier screenshots even showed the androgynous appearance has always been a constant. While yes, the characters would have been seen or perceived by American audiences perhaps differently back when this game was intended to come out, it doesn't change that these characters were created very much intentionally to be a major part of the story. These characters are the guardians of the Seven Needles of the Nowhere Islands, and help Lucas and his party every step of the way, intentionally or not. And we'll come back to this scene later. Are they stereotypical? Yes, but let's be honest, the EarthBound series has never shied away from being stereotypical, much less Nintendo. If you want to get really technical, somewhat androgynous characters weren't even all that different in Nintendo. But to not dwell on that, my point is that these characters were treated with a lot of respect. Toei even said that they were part of the story to show the value in having friends with different appearances and abilities. And when you have that information and perceive them this way, I think they're a rather flattering portrayal of androgynous people. They weren't created at all with the intention of belittling these types of people, but to kind of caricaturize them, in the same way EarthBound does with many of its characters. One of the lesser common, albeit still present arguments, is the game's more overt use of drug use. Now, while I can say, well, this kind of happened in EarthBound too, all day, it's much more overt and goes on for much longer in this game. I can't deny it's much more explicit about what it's trying to convey. And while my answer is more general, my counterpoint at large is, if Nintendo really had a problem with this, I don't think they would care if the game was rated T for teen instead of E. Initially, EarthBound was being aimed at young children. Yeah, EarthBound was being aimed at young kids. But on its re-release was re-rated to T for teen actually. Even more surprising to me than EarthBound's re-rating is EarthBound Beginning's rating. This is an NES game that's rated T for teen. How often do you see that? This really makes me question why they even bothered localizing certain things like certain lines of dialogue and sprites, but whatever. But despite these ratings, these games have been bestsellers every time they've been re-released. And this is why I highly doubt something like drug use would prevent this game's release outside of Japan. Now, while it has been confirmed that content never had anything to do with it, there are a couple things that I raise my eyebrows at thinking of this being released. To me, there are two major things that I'm surprised I don't see more people bringing up in regards to content being the barrier to its release. The first one to me is Reggie. Not that one. That one. Yeah. Look, I'm not trying to make any statements here. I'm just saying that if anything was to be problematic to an American audience, I feel like it might be this. To me, I feel like way before you see people complaining about Lucas eating mushrooms in a forest, you would probably get a few letters about this. The other one to me is the scene with Lucas and Ionia in the hot spring. Itoi's played very coy about what actually goes on in this scene literally, but it seems like a lot of players have a pretty clear interpretation of what they perceive is going on here. I guess if they had no intentions of changing it, they can technically have the carte blanche that it's never revealed what's happening. And it only ever happens once in the game. I mean, seriously, can you imagine if every time you got a new PSI move you had to go through something like this? Now, regardless of how you feel about either of these two things, I'm relieved to know that they weren't planning on changing them for a release. As quote-unquote controversial as many of these aspects are, I'm always for the notion of less changes being made to an artist's work than more. Not to suggest that changes can't be made that are good or sometimes even better in my opinion. And who knows, maybe if they do decide to fully translate the game themselves instead of just taking the fan translation at some point, maybe they could even get the old team back together to translate it. They've made many well-received localization choices before. The last point I want to touch on is that many people think the game hasn't been released due to its critiques of capitalism. And to be honest, I don't really have a good counterpoint to this. My only really possible counterpoint to this is, once again, if all of these things wouldn't stop it in my opinion, why would this? Again, especially when being handled by one of their most trusted writer-directors. Despite recent claims, there's still much speculation to be made. I do think, however, that the argument the game's too controversial to be released outside of Japan makes less and less sense as time moves on, especially as social values seem to be shifting. Even if the game does get officially localized by Nintendo and they don't use the fan translation, and the new translation, quote, ruins the game like so many fans think it would, I just want to live in a world where we can have both. It's also really important to remember that Nintendo's not releasing Mother 3 just because they don't want to. They only own half the intellectual property. Itoi owns half of Mother. For this reason, largely it's left to Itoi to kickstart Mother projects. Shigesato Itoi and Satoru Iwata were really great friends, and with Satoru Iwata's unfortunate passing, more or less both Itoi's connections with Nintendo and the gaming industry at large were severed. It's not a matter of not caring, it's much more like Mother 3, where it's more of a broken household. Not only is it largely left to Itoi to start the project if he wanted it to be, he would also be taking a huge responsibility upon himself. These games are like his children, he loves them. And when EarthBound was being localized, he signed off on every translated piece of dialogue. And Mother 3, in terms of text, is longer than EarthBound. Itoi's in his 70s, guys. I hope one day Mother 3 can make it to the West, and who knows, maybe one day it will. But in the meantime, I think we should be thankful that we already have such a lovely and professionally done translation. So, in conclusion, stop harassing Reggie. Harass Doug Bowser.